Hello everyone and welcome to the Unity 101 Fundamentals class with your host instructor, Nelson LeKay.
Hey.
Hey, all right, and also joining us, as you can almost call him one of the instructors now, Gavin Whitlock. Hey, Gavin.
Hello.
Hello, sir. And this time around, while I'll be here, I will not be as heavily involved with paying close attention for anything I want to jump in and poke fun at these guys about, but Jason. So with that, let's go ahead and hand this over to Nelson and get things going.
Alrighty, so I'm going to go ahead and launch what we did last week. Now, the first bit of today's class is actually going to be seeing if anybody had any issues about last week's stuff. As you probably are aware, the homework was to re-implement what we built last week. So if you have problems or if you ran into some issues, now's your chance to, well, talk.
To speak up. Talk. Speak up. Ask.
I mean, if you
want. Well, while they're thinking of questions, do you want to give a rundown on video of what we're going to cover this week?
Yeah, well, this week we're just going to be taking a look at adding in the concept of lives to our game, adding in the ability to win the game by reaching a certain point in the level, and then we're going to be taking a look at putting together some meshes and creating some prefabs, some sort of building blocks that we'll be using in the game to construct it. Now, I want to point out really quickly that the prefabs that we're going to be creating using the meshes that hopefully everybody has downloaded is really just a sort of rough sketch of the game. And we're not intending for, these prefabs to be like, what game quality, but that's typically what you do, especially during play testing, where you put together assets and you work with them and put them into a game, set up the scripts, and then maybe work on the artistic side later once everything is working the way you expect it to. Obviously, that's a very good way to go about doing a game in the first place, because getting the gameplay down is, of course, the most important aspect to it. And as you start getting the gameplay down, things may come up during development that may even change the direction that your assets would go in the first place.
And above and beyond that, assuming, obviously for the most part, people in this class will be working probably on their own on the project at the moment. But if you're working with a team and say you're the programmer and you've got asset modelers and textures and stuff, you're not going to be able to wait for them to finish everything, and they're not going to be able to wait for you to finish what you're doing in order to get started on their work. So if you're working with just sort of animatics, which mean very basic assets just as placeholders that you can then swap out at a later time for pretty assets and so forth, then you can get on faster, but also you can give that to your modeler as an idea of sort of how much space things should take up, what size they should be, and which directions they should be facing and things.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
We did get a question. We did get a. Well, yeah, besides what else, we're just going to be putting together some assets, some decks and turrets and stuff like that, and putting those together, getting the prefabs set up, and talking about how to, construct prefabs that we'll be using as the building blocks of our levels. And that's really about it for this week. There are a few discussions that I have planned during the progression of today's material. We did get a question about ReSharper adding code we can't see. Now, I know that there's been a discussion on the forums about that. I wanted to point out, though, that I have been saying using statements that have been added to the project by ReSharper, and when it occurs. The only time that ReSharper will add code that you can't see is in the case of a using statement. So I really quickly want to run down a quick feature for people who may be confused about this, who are using Visual Studio without ReSharper. I want to just make a quick note that there is an actual feature within Visual Studio that will help you with that issue. Now, again, I'll try my best to ensure that people are made aware of when using directives get added. But for people who do not have ReSharper but have Visual Studio, I do want to point out a really quick feature that's built into Visual Studio as far as using statements are concerned. Now, if you don't know, there's two things. If you're getting an error that says something like this, so I'm going to go ahead and nuke out all of the using statements. If you get an error, something like, I don't know, new dictionary, int. If you get an error like this that says, type or namespace name dictionary cannot be found, are you missing a using directive or assembly reference? You are either missing a using directive or assembly reference, or you are misnaming whatever method or member or type you are attempting to use. Now, if you have ReSharper, ReSharper will helpfully tell you that this type is available via this namespace, as you can see right there. If you do not have ReSharper, however, you'll notice that when you click on this, when this is a properly spelled type, Visual Studio itself gives you the opportunity to click on this little tooltip thingy and say, add in a using systems collection generic, which in this case is where this type comes from. If you have neither Visual Studio or ReSharper, you can find the namespaces that you have to import by, well, searching. So
Google?
Right.
I mean, I know it's really, if you put, something like dictionary namespace, C# dictionary namespace into Google, you will, and you watch, this won't work now.
Yeah.
Just to be a pain.
Yep. See, msdn.microsoft.com, which is the source of, in this case, this is the standard source of information about .NET Framework. You click on this and wait a year or two, and you'll notice right here that it says right there, Systems Collections Generic, which is the namespace for this type. So I just wanted to point that out. And
Sire did just say in BuzzNet, yes, it can get confusing due to things like IEnumerable and IEnumerable of T, but, well, make sure that, sorry, this is just me, make sure you're actually looking for the thing that you're supposed to be looking for. This is why I'm hot on spelling and punctuation and capitalization and things, because otherwise it doesn't work. If you've got to know what you're looking for in order to look for it. But yeah. No, but MSDN will tell you the difference as well.
Yes. Last thing, for people who do have ReSharper installed, I do want to point out, I know this isn't a ReSharper video, but this is topical. If you wanted to, let's say we wanted to instantiate a dictionary, but we don't have a dictionary listed, maybe we don't know how to spell dictionary. After typing in new, what you can do is hit Alt-Shift-Space, and then you can start typing in dictionary. And when you hit enter, the using statement will automatically pop up. So again, that's Alt-Shift-Space. And this will actually search every single imported reference in your entire solution. So if I start typing in array list, there it is. If I started typing in stream, there it is. And by simply hitting enter, we get the appropriate using statement. But that was just, I just wanted to point that out, even though that's not really a focus here. So yeah, if you're getting an error saying that you are missing a using statement or reference, using declaration or a assembly reference, then you need to find out which namespace that you need to import. And I will say it during video, which namespaces are imported for which things. And I'm sorry if that's too quick or that.
The other thing I want to cover, just because it's tangentially related to that, is that I've still seen people doing this, even in the last couple of weeks in the forums. There's still people saying, I've got an error, and I don't know what it means. And clearly they're not reading the error because they're not posting the error either. Error messages are long and convoluted and scary looking because they give you a lot of information. Right. Usually, they'll certainly tell you what sort of error you've got. And half the time they will give you a specific line reference and character reference down to, it's line 27 and it's the 18th character on that line. People just seem to go, oh, I've got an error. It doesn't work. Well, read the error, try and take in what it's saying to you. And again, if you don't understand the error, literally copy and paste that into a Google search. That's one thing that is guaranteed to to give you answers because,
Yeah, and if you still
Well,
can't
people-
find the problem, I mean, don't be afraid of posting on the forums. But if you do post on
no,
the
no,
forums,
absolutely.
please
Yeah,
include
exactly.
the
Yeah,
error.
please post the error, or otherwise all that will happen is, the next day someone will come along and go, well, what error have you got? And then you'll have to post the error. So,
Christian, you could have a different keyboard scheme than me, so you might want to look into that. It should work, though. But like I said, it's possible that you have a different keyboard scheme. There's two keyboard schemes you can use with ReSharper, the IntelliJ keyboard scheme and the Visual Studio keyboard scheme. I'm not an IntelliJ user, therefore I've never used that keyboard scheme, so I don't know if that could be the issue. Okay, I'm going to fire up Visual Studio. We did have another...
in answer to Sean's question, no, there's no difference. That's just a different version of ReSharper.
Right,
It's the same for me. I don't get that color scheming.
I want to...
That's only the most recent version, isn't it?
The second most recent, actually, as of version 6. Version 7 was released a few days ago, actually.
Oh, was it?
Yep, I'm going to get that upgraded very soon here. But for people who may be watching the video and curious themselves, what he's referring to is the color for this format parameter. Notice even not only is this format parameter colorized, if I click on this parameter, the particular format for this gets highlighted. That's a feature of ReSharper 6. Okay, I don't know... Doesn't Unity have a forum on the site? Thought it did. Okay.
What, on 3D Buzz?
Yeah.
Yeah. Does it not? Yeah, I'm sure it does.
It has to. That would
Perhaps
be
it doesn't.
insanity.
You made it.
No, it was before my time. Yeah. Under...
So are VHS tapes.
Under Gaming, Unity. It is a Unity forum. Okay, blah, da, da, da. Let's see. Ryan, I'll get back to that question in a second because that one might require us to just flip over to your screen. I'll answer the easier questions first. Did we set up to detract points from the player if they collided with the quad section, or was it only to add 10 points upon successfully flying through? As of right now, the quad sections simply destroy the player. We will be visiting this code, not directly, but we will be talking about what should happen when the player ship is destroyed later in this video today. Okay, so if that's everybody's questions that are easy to answer, then let's see. Ryan, my triggers when I'm not registering for death or for points. Do you mind if we hop over onto your screen?
Yeah, because this is going to be a missed checkbox somewhere,
Yeah.
and it's confusing even when you've done it yourself and you can see it. It really is one thing I don't particularly like in how it's all set up.
Okay.
Hey, Ryan. Yep.
Hey.
Hello. Okay, so you said you are not getting any collision, basically.
Yeah. It's just not registering anything. Not points or anything.
Okay. First, check your quad sections. Could you click on one of your quad sections and look at the inspector? You have a box collider. It's set to its trigger. That's correct. Click on the gate and make sure the gate should have a rigid body, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
I can verify that really quickly. Yes, the gate should have a rigid body with that set. All right. Check the player. Jump over to your player ship. Now the player ship. That is correct. It is set to have a trigger. Okay, there's a
Probably a code problem. Then.
Yeah, you could have a misspelling. Could you double-click on your player script? Well, that is how you spell trigger, if I'm not mistaken. Could you go ahead and add, after line 28, a debug log? So debug.log, and then just pass in bleh or something, I don't know.
And this is a good example for the rest of you, that this is a standard procedure when trying to debug within Unity.
Yep.
And Ryan, remember, yeah, capital L's.
All right, so now if you go and fire this up, make sure that your console window is visible, which I can't see, actually. So go to, like, Window, Console. Okay, just make sure that's visible. And now play and see what happens.
No.
Odd.
Very. Let's see. So you have... Oh. I think we're stupid, Gavin. Yeah, we're dumb. Okay, before I tell you what the problem is, I want to rant for a second, like I've ranted multiple times about Unity. Having your objects, the environment that your object is in, have method names that are not tied to any static code whatsoever, either through inheritance or interface implementation, is asinine.
Not Pony 9.
Yes, Pony 9. If you jump back into your player script, it's actually not on trigger, it's on
trigger,
trigger
enter.
enter.
Psycho Bolt got it. Doesn't it?
There are quite a few people on the questions panel, too. I can't believe I've missed that myself, but it's like, oh, come on.
But this is the thing. There's so many possible little oddities that it could be. It's all really well if there's only one thing. Yay!
Yay.
You can now die. Hurrah!
Alrighty, I'm going to jump back over to...
Thanks, guys.
Yep.
That's all right.
Yeah, that sort of stuff, I don't fault anybody who makes a mistake like that, because, like I said, it is... I don't know why. I just don't know why they did that. Also, be sure to switch your questions over to questions instead of chat, by the way. Just a heads up. Because last time I made somebody a presenter, they were sending in questions in the chat, and I wasn't seeing it. Okay. So, I know it's more a programming question, but since I haven't finished C# classes, why particular the naming _ manager? Well,
House style.
Yes, it is. I do want to point out that...
Very common house style.
Incredibly common.
And ReSharper will tell you to do it that way.
By default, yes.
By default.
ReSharper actually has a really awesome naming convention setup system. But this way is just simply preferable, in my opinion. I think that there are two objective reasons why having a preceding underscore in a field makes your code considerably more readable and less error prone than otherwise. The biggest reason is our methods that, let's say I had a constructor on player that took in a game manager. Oh, come on. There you go. Called manager, and simply assigned it to his local field. So let's say I had a player constructor that took in a game manager called manager, and he assigned it to a local field called manager. Well, without this underscore, look what we have. The code looks like this. Now, ReSharper is helpfully graying it out, telling me that I'm stupid, but you wouldn't get that gray out font if you didn't have ReSharper installed. The only way to fix this is to do this dot manager equals manager. And I find that especially when you have a long list of fields to initialize, that sometimes they use this dot and sometimes they don't use this dot. I just find it ridiculously over verbose and ugly. The second sort of objective reason why I would highly suggest people adopt this naming convention for local fields is that it's much easier in a method to be able to identify if an object you are working on is either a local variable or a parameter, or it's a local field. It may not, to people, especially people new to coding, it may not seem that big of a deal because you haven't maybe had the experience of reading a lot of code. But having the ability to quickly determine if something is a field versus a local variable really increases the readability of the code. That being said, you will find that Microsoft itself wants people to not use the underscore. You'll find other people who have M underscore. You'll find people who have underscore capitalized. I mean, I think that out of all the different naming styles, there are more naming styles for local fields than any other, any other type of member.
Cool. Let's do some Unity.
Okay. Just everyone, I guess we're jumping right into the class now. If that's wow, out of this many people, those are the only questions. I guess everybody got stuff done last week.
I think everyone had the same question, apparently.
Alrighty. So let's jump into the first thing we're going to be talking about. I'm going to make a modification to the code. So everybody who's going to be participating, go ahead and hit participate. Okay, the first modification I'm going to be making to this code is... Actually, let's do some crowdsourced debugging.
Oh, aye. This will go well.
Why can't I move my player ship? I'm hitting the keys,
yes.
but it doesn't move. I'm hitting them. Game window is selected. The input is configured. The keyboard is plugged in.
Chris, do you work in support professionally? Fruit Nut is the winner.
Yay. Okay, the problem is that if you remember in the code, the movement code in particular, when I do my translations, I multiply the time delta by the axis by the player speed lateral. Now, obviously, if the player speed lateral is 0, the result of this expression will, always be 0 because it is just multiplication. What I'm going to go ahead and do is instead of allowing this setting to exist as something sort of configurable within the inspector, which invites the possibility of it being reset back down to 0, I'm going to go ahead and hard code a value on line 16 to have player speed lateral equal 16.
This means that when that script is dragged and dropped onto something, any values that you set in field initializers like that will be the default values. And in fact, now if you save that and flip back over to Unity and just reset the reset the script. Reset the script.
Yes. So that's this little gear icon down to reset.
You notice that everything else zeroes out immediately.
Right.
Because there were no values set and 0 is the default value by default. Similarly, there's no textures set for the start, lose and win screens. But the one that we did set in code is the default value now.
Yep.
One thing to watch out is anything where you've set it like that in a field initializer, if you change it in Unity, it won't update your code for you, because that would be undesirable, really. Set a default value, you want it to stay a default value. Equally, though, if you go over into Visual Studio and you say, actually 16 is too much, I'm going to set it to 8, that won't be picked up by Unity. Field initializers do not get automatically picked up by Unity. So you will then have to either reset or just change it in Unity.
Ooh, Wolf's getting an error. Let me see if that's the error that I got as well. You said, because this is the second time that this has happened to me. Oh, no, of course it's not going to do it again. But are you getting an error on this semi saying invalid expression? A little squigglied? Or not squiggly, a red. If you hit Control-Shift-B, do you get a build succeeded down the bottom left? Like, do you get any compiler errors? So I do want to kind of point this out. This is a bug in ReSharper. If you hit Control-Shift-B to do a solution rebuild, do you get a build succeeded message that is currently being pushed off my screen? But more importantly, do you have an error list of no items in it? Because I did actually experience this particular bug in ReSharper. If you don't see anything happening, it's probably the bug.
That'll be fine then.
Right. ReSharper...
The easiest way to test is just to close that script and reopen it from the Solution Explorer.
Right.
And it will have gone away.
Yeah. Sometimes ReSharper decides that it doesn't like one of the characters in your file, and it'll squiggle it and tell you invalid expression or some other bogus error, even though it's not a real compiler error. If you close the file and reopen it, the error will go away. Okay, and it seems to happen when assigning fields to using field initializers. Okay, so that's it with the player speed lateral. Now that we have that, we have the bug fixed and hopefully put in sort of a situation that it won't happen again, or it'll be more difficult for us to forget in the future. All right, the next bit that we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a finish line. So this is going to be fun. So go ahead, and everybody who is participating, well, watch. And you know that's me resetting your ready checks, right? I'm the one doing that. As in, I'm intending for it to say not ready, like on purpose. Okay, so what we're going to do is we are going to basically create a copy of the gate, but we're going to switch it up a little bit. We're going to create a new gate prefab thing, and instead of having the little guy that you see over on the edge of the gate called goal, which is just really a box collider, instead of him having this goal script on it, which of course will give a player points if they hit that goal, we're going to have it actually, well, consider the game to be won. So to do that...
I mean, our finish line is essentially going to be a very much larger version of a gate. It's literally going to be the same thing. It's going to be four grid sections and an extra a goal in the middle. But we're going to name them slightly differently, and we're going to make it bigger, and we're going to put it at the end of the level and change the script so that it does something different.
Pretty much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in my prefabs. I'm going to instantiate another gate. So go ahead and instantiate another gate at the origin. So 0, 0, 0. Get that gate instantiated. I'm going to go ahead and hide all my other gates. Actually, I'm going to completely hide segment 1. You guys don't have to do that, but I just wanted to clear up some of my stuff. Okay, so now that we have a gate, this is an instantiation of a prefab. What we want to do is disassociate this particular game object from the prefab. The way we do that is by clicking on the prefab in our hierarchy and going to the game object menu and saying break prefab instance.
You'll note that as soon as you did that, everything to do with that gate turned back to normal pale grey, as opposed to, well, like the player, which is still just a prefab and therefore is bright blue.
Right. Or black if you don't have professional. And remember that my skin is the only reason to upgrade to professional.
It's the single best reason to upgrade.
Okay, so
So
now that we have a gate instantiated, but it's no longer a prefab, what we can do here is we can go ahead and, well, make this stuff bigger. So this is going to be a fun bit. What I'm going to go ahead and do first is I'm going to go ahead and scale up everything by 5. Now I did that by selecting all of the quad sections of this gate, and I added a scale of 5 to each one of the components of the scale transform, or the scale component of the transform. So is everybody good so far?
now it's just a question of moving them around so that they...
Yeah. I'm just going to go ahead and eyeball this, just like how I did before. So I'm going to move this guy down, and I'm going to move this guy to the left. Again, remember, these are really only temporary assets that we're using to get a feel for the game. So I'm not worried about making everything absolutely perfect at this point. Now, obviously, in a later stage of development, you would.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just kind of eyeballed it and got all the little quad sections to align the way I wanted them to. There's a little bit, I mean, we can do that, I guess, and maybe a little bit of this. No, a little bit of that, maybe a little bit of this. Okay, so now that we have this set up, the last thing we need to do, and I'll pause after we get through this one last bit, is we need to scale up our goal. Because right now our goal is very small. Again, I'm not going to worry about multiplying 7 by 5. I mean, well, I could. Don't you love it when you think that, when you get intimidated by a math problem, it turns out to be something trivial? And then I'm going to scale it up just a little bit, and then maybe move it to the left a little bit, and then jump over into this view and move it
This is
forward.
the key thing that you want to make sure you do as well, which is obviously make sure it, again, appears behind the outer gate. Although in this case, I mean, the outer gates are really just a... Basically, initially this was set up with just the goal section of it, but everyone who played it immediately had to be told that they had to keep on flying after the end of the
Yeah, I just cancelled that one.
there was no visual reference to the fact that there was any reason to carry on. So, but yeah, we made it nice and big because it's not supposed to be a challenge. It's just there to say, hello, this is where you're aiming at.
Yep.
And you could change the colour of it. You make it bright purple with green spots or something. But
Yep. Or add particle effects or whatever it is you want to.
yeah.
Okay, so then I'm...
Now, are you going to rename them?
Actually, I'll do that in 1 second. I do want to go ahead and create one empty script real fast. This is just going to be an empty script. It's not going to have anything on it. So under scripts, I'm going to say create C# script, and I'm going to call this finish line. So that's it. I'm not adding any code to this yet. I just want to have it there so we can actually finish creating the prefab before we pause the video. So now that I have this empty script called finish line, I'm going to go ahead and attach it to the goal. And then I'm going to take care to remove the existing goal script from it. So now our finish line script is added to the goal. And then like Gavin was talking about a few seconds ago, I'm going to go ahead and rename this. And the reason I'm going to rename this is I don't want people to get confused between this gate and, well, another gate. So I'm going to rename this gate to finish gate. And I'm going to rename the goal inside of it to finish line. And the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to click and drag finish gate over into prefabs to turn it into a prefab. And that's it. Then if I make my segment 1 appear again, we now have a finish gate.
I suppose you could move.
From Finland.
You could move that down into position.
Yeah, I could do that.
No, that would have more ends.
Actually, I'll fix up the positions of these gates once we get back, because I think at this point we're probably losing a few
Okay.
people. Because, even though this was roughed out, I do want to get some better positioning in. Okay, so that's really about it. To review the steps, I instantiated a gate prefab. I used the game object break prefab instance menu option to disassociate it from the prefab, the game object from the prefab. I moved and sized all of the quad sections around to get to the size that I wanted, including the line, the finish line. I created a script called finish line, and I attached it to the finish line game object. And then I simply turned this into a prefab. And that was it.
For probably more my own pedantic feelings of safety rather than anything that actually does go on nowadays with Unity, generally once I've dragged something across and made it into a prefab, I will nuke the version that I was working on and then, drag a new prefab back into the scene. Just, it makes me feel better. is largely why I do that. It just makes me comfortable that I know that the prefab matches what I've now got in the scene and everything all is happy and smiling.
Yes.
So you're going to pause and...
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and pause the video. And we're back. So, Gav, you mentioned some stuff that we need to cover.
Yeah, well, we're about to start moving some stuff around, and the first thing to move around before we start laying these out is going to be our camera. Now, I came to the conclusion that the camera wasn't actually in the best of positions. Because currently, the player's right in the middle of the screen, and really whatever goes on behind him is irrelevant. So we've got all that screen space wasted. And you're quite close to the player as well. If you go into playing it, Nelson, that would work. You're quite close up to the player. It doesn't give you a lot of leeway to move left and right and so forth. But so if and actually, Nelson, if you can refer to the other version
Alrighty, so
that I sent back to you for the numbers.
We're going to move this camera to an X of 20, a Y of 30, and a Z of 0. Then the rotation is going to stay the same.
Yeah. Basically, initially, all I did was double the distances, and then I zeroed out Z, and it worked out to be roughly where I wanted it, essentially. Again, there's a lot of the things that I find it gnaws at me, but this is what you do when you've got visual things like this, where basically you just drag it around till it looks right, and then I generally round the numbers off so that you don't get horrible floating point errors if you have to multiply or divide anything.
Right.
But yeah, so yeah, that's all that happens to the camera.
Okay, so the last bit that I'm going to be doing here, well, no, not the last bit, another bit that I'm going to be doing here.
The last bit, the first bit.
Yes, the remainder of the first bit, I'm going to be taking the finish gate, and every time I say it, the finish gate.
That would have two ends.
Well, still though, it's phonetically similar. So if I take the finish gate and place it in segment 1, that is a requirement for, well, getting it to move along with the background. Okay, so now I'm going to position all my gates. I'm going to start with the first gate. I'm going to give him a Z of 50. I'm going to be positioning all of the gates at 50 increments. So, hopefully everybody...
While you go ahead and do that,
here can count.
because Wolf just said, C. Nelson's finish gate is not the same spot as his player ship. Actually, that is down to the fact that it was at the same spot. It's just that it wasn't centered up around its pivot point. The pivot point on Nelson's model is off to the left somewhere.
Okay, so basically what I did was I moved every gate in 50 increments.
And you put the finish line at the very end.
Yes, the finish line. I'm never going to get over that. Okay, so let's go ahead and
And for anyone who, because I actually only have the vaguest of memories of you saying it, which was that the other thing is the finish line, the finish gate, and we talked about this off camera as well, has to be made, the segment 1 needs to be its parent.
indeed. So as you'll notice here that I moved finish gate into segment 1. Do we have anybody here from Finland? That's just a random question while everybody's catching up really quickly. Just curious. Alrighty, so moving on, let's go ahead and start actually implementing our finish gate in a way that actually works.
This is going to be fairly straightforward.
Yes, I do want to... I am going to back up once, though. I'm going to change the current state property, the setter, into a private setter. And then I'm going
So this is in, hang on, right. This is in Game Manager, line 19.
Yes. Game Manager. I changed this property to be private. And then I'm going to add a method called switch state that takes in an iGame state. And...
Called state.
Yep, and sets it.
In fact, it should be called new state, really. But.
Yeah, probably.
So you changed that from like an hour and a half ago. I don't know. It's just like my brain hurts when you do that. Can you?
Oh, I complete. See, I've always used that terminology though. That's and when I read it in the first time I read your code, I actually read in switch state.
Yeah. You see, I called that current state. But anyway, this is just it hurts my brain.
But anyway, what I'm doing here is this is a completely stylistic thing for the moment. But because of the possibility of adding some additional logic into our switch state capability, I wanted to turn it into a method. And I am sacrificing quite a bit of design principles and my own style of coding for this lesson for people who are not maybe familiar with C# as much. But this sort of stylistic thing was really gnawing at me in the sense that changing a property was making a significant change to our runtime. And that's typically not something you should do with setters on properties. I've seen people abuse property setters to ridiculous extents. And in reality, changing a property should really not modify the runtime of your code substantially. It should be for changing data. So that's why I made that little change.
It has to be said, it was irritating enough that it was actually gnawing at me as well. So it's just like, and I don't know nearly as much about coding as Nelson does, but yeah, it's just wrong to do that. Now, if you try and build, though, you will notice that you have a huge number of errors.
Yep.
This is good, because this means you can go through these one by one.
Right.
Because this error is caused by the fact that he made the setter of the property private. Thus, it can't be accessed from anywhere else.
And if we read the error, we'll see the property GameManager.currentState cannot be used in this context because the set accessor is inaccessible. Okay, so let's go ahead and change the code. What is the code going to look like now? Well, instead of manager.currentState equals, we're going to be doing manager switch state and then a new instantiation of the state. And that's it. For all of the errors, we're simply going to be making that one little change. Plain game state, however, I'm putting off to the side. We will get back to this very shortly.
In fact, for now, just because it has both of them there, there's two instances there together, if once you've changed all the others, if you change it in your playing game state, for one of those but not the other, just so that then you've got both on screen at the same time. So anytime you see what's on line 20 there, change it to what's on line 18.
Yes. And
And make sure that you put in the correct screen state.
Right.
Which...
I do want to point out, though, that we will be deleting lines 17 through 22 very shortly. Or, sorry, 17 through lines 21. So don't get too attached to these lines of code.
Yeah, no, I only picked out that place just so that people could see what they were looking for and what they were replacing it with at the same time.
And remember, the compiler is your friend. Control-Shift-B will give you a nice little list of all compilation errors that you can go through. So always keep that in mind that, something you don't really get with dynamic languages, you get with static languages, in that the compiler will tell you everything that's up. As far as the game manager, again, all I did was change the accessibility of the setter to private, and I added a method called switch state. Again, this is just a little cleanliness thing that I kind of got annoyed at, and Gavin got annoyed at as well.
Yeah, it's the exact same functionality, as evidenced by how easy it was to change. We just moved it to where it ought to be, which is in the game manager. So the game manager is dealing with changing its own state. You tell the game manager to change its state rather than, going looking for a game manager and changing its state. It's the difference between asking somebody for a cigarette and mugging them. That was a really good analogy for this. I'm quite pleased with that. It's funny, I watched Crunch Connection last night, that's why. That would be because you're missing parentheses, Dementis, I'm guessing.
Yeah, most likely. Manager dot switch state open parenthesis expression close parenthesis. Parenthesis.
I fixed it. And Mikkel, did that, or Michael, in fact, sorry, can't read. Did that, did you get what you needed from Game Manager? Ben, yeah, that, your code doesn't look the same as Nelson's, and that'd be why.
Yeah, Ben, what's the line of code that's throwing?
Start screen state, line 17.
Well, what's his line of code look like? I mean,
Oh, yeah, sorry, that's your point.
because my line of code on line 17 is correct.
Cyrus has got the same error.
Yeah, seems like we have a lot of people with the same error. Yeah, you don't have an equals there. What people are doing is they're saying this.
There's no equals. That's what I said. Your code isn't the same. I don't know. This is why I don't know how to explain these any clearer. Look at the code that's there. Look at what you've got, character by character. If it's not identical, then no, it won't work and you'll get errors.
Right.
And this isn't aimed directly at Ben and Cyrus. This is just a general point that is starting to bug me with doing all these classes. People don't have the same thing, but swear blind that they do. You see it in the forums all the time. Oh, my code's exactly the same as that in the video. Here, look. And you go, well, it's spelt different for a start.
But yeah, anyway, so yeah, this is obviously not going to work because you cannot assign a method group. And hey, look, cannot assign because it's a method group. Okay.
Luke screen state, assets code start screen state is a type but is used like a variable. You're missing parentheses. Probably.
Let me see, line 18, what's being used as a type? Start screen state.
Start screen state.
Yeah, you might be missing a new. That would give you, give you, that error is a type but it's used like a variable. You need to instantiate it. Okay, so last bit, if we jump over to playing game state, I'm going to delete these lines of code. Make sure that your update method looks like this.
When you say these...
Yeah, well, I was about to back up. I deleted the lines of code that arbitrarily allow you to win or lose the game. So the input, get key down on return in space, I am removing. So now the update method of the playing game state should only have a scroll background invocation. So is everybody good on that bit?
If you're still jumping around between code, hit 1 more minute. Otherwise, we will head on. We'll look at the update method of playing game state.
Right.
It should just be scroll background, parentheses, semicolon.
All I did was I removed the artificial ability for you to win or lose the game.
Which actually makes it less boring. Kinda, sorta. Cool.
Okay. So moving
Next thing
on
is to make it
let's
possible to win the game, I guess.
Yeah, let's go ahead and make the game winnable. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the finish line script. I'm going to nuke out all this stuff. I'm going to fix up the indentation, and I'm going to take out this stupid extraneous using. And
Extraneous.
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 Extraneous. And yeah, I'm going to add a little bit of code here. The code that I'm going to be adding is very straightforward and will fit on one screen, so I'm not worried about having stuff pop up. Notice, by the way, for all the people who don't have ReSharper, I am just typing in capital G, capital M to get Game Manager.
I think Visual Studio does that as well now. Or do you have to GA?
I don't think 2010 doesn't. I don't know about 2011 though. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and have this class implement iGameEntity. I'm going to bring down its implementation, and I'm simply going to say manager change state.
Change state.
Sorry, switch state. Windscreen state manager. And that's it. Important notes about this code, things that people might not immediately realize. First of all, I implemented iGameEntity. And by doing so...
Don't forget the comma.
Yeah, don't forget the comma. And make sure that it comes after monoBehavior, because monoBehavior is a class and you may only inherit from a single class, whereas iGameEntity is an interface, so it has to appear after the class inheritance. By inheriting or by implementing iGameEntity, it necessitates that I have to implement a method called collide that accepts a player. The body of this method simply switches the manager over to the windscreen state, passing in the manager as its constructor argument. And then finally, the magical method start, which again, I absolutely despise these. All I do is I simply assign manager to GameObject.findGameManager, and I grab the GameManager component out of it.
Which, as many of you will gather, you could have copied and pasted out of other places in your code, because you've done that before. So do you actually do a reset everyone's ready checks?
Yeah, I just did. And
Cool. So once you're ready, hit ready. Once you've got all this and it builds and compiles and don't have any errors.
and then hit 1 more minute if you're still working, of course. We really need to rename that button to still working.
At keyboard. One of these days you'll set me up so I can actually see it.
All right.
It's like, Greg, you just nailed why once you use ReSharper you'll never go back. It's just it makes life easy.
So many scripts for a kind of simple game. Huh?
Yeah, you see, this is not a lot of scripts for a start. Secondly, as anyone who's seen any of Nelson's production code will know, this is minimal. Secondly, what have we got so far? We've got a finish line. All that does is
Collides with the player.
marks where the finish is. We've got a game manager that basically is just a state machine.
And it contains
and
like
deals
global
with
state.
global variables and stuff. We've got a gate. Well, that's the same as the finish line. It's just a gate. We've got the goal, which is part of the gate, and we've got the player, which deals with the player. If you want to make anything more complex than the most basic of things, you're going to need different functionality in different places.
Right. I mean,
Now, it has to be said, in the effort to keep this simple, i.e. to keep it more in Unity and less the way we would go about doing this normally, but probably actually, if anything, using more scripts. I think in my version that I was going with, I had a game manager and a player. They were the only monobehavers I started with.
right. I mean, it's just as far as a simple game having this many scripts, which scripts aren't necessary? I mean, there's no aspect of our game logic that we're expressing that doesn't necessitate the existence of the scripts that are there. The only code that you might say, well, that isn't necessary, is the states. But the states are also necessary in that they provide, well, the ability to switch between a start game, a lose game, and a win game, and provides on GUI stuff. So it's not really as if this is a lot of code, and that's just how it is working with Unity. There's no way for Unity to work without you telling it what to do, and a script is a way of telling Unity what to do.
Because you're saying that, about the amount of code. At the most basic level, if you think about it, there's a certain amount, it's like startup costs for a business. There's a certain amount of code that you're going to need. You're going to need input handling. You're going to need collision handling. Whether that is between two cubes that are just got colors on them and are on a black background. I mean, in fact, Pong. Pong actually has probably almost as many lines of code as this does going on behind the scenes, because a lot of stuff is cruft that has to be done whatever the game. People must have typed that by now. If there's anyone still typing, hit one more minute and have a good reason. I shall eat some chocolate.
But as far as comparing this to a AAA title,
scary amount of code.
yeah,
Properly scary amount of code.
there will be a lot more code. The fact is,
thousands of lines of code.
Millions of lines of code if you include an engine with it. I mean, yeah, this is nothing. It really is, and you can't do game programming without programming. And programming
there is no make game button.
And I want to point this out right now, and I've said this quite a bit. Programming has been an art form that has been developed over decades, since the 50s, as far as high-level programming goes. To this day, programming, or textual programming languages, continue to be the most succinct way to describe interaction logic than any other method that has been developed in the last 60 years. There's no easier way or no more concise way to describe interaction logic than code. Now, you do have tools like Kimset, or Kimest, or you know what I'm talking about.
Kismet.
Kismet is good for simple interactions, sure, but once you get into complex interactions, you end up with a massive graph compared to the 20 lines of code that could replace it. You know what I mean? Per character,
this is the big thing
per
with
square inch, code provides the most bang for your buck for describing logic, and always will be.
For me, it's the massive selling point of Unity is the fact that you get to work with not some scripting language that has been put together that only deals with whoever was putting it together thought it should deal with. You're dealing with C#, which is a mature, broad spectrum language, which you can code everything from a game to an interface to whatever you want in. That means that you've got all this power available to you that you wouldn't otherwise have. And it means you can take advantage of, standard DLLs and things that other people have made to deal with all the heavy stuff. That, the nasty maths calculation libraries that you have to do and so forth.
Okay, so we did have my code for finish line is building, but game manager, game object, player, and win screen are not light blue. If they are not light blue, you might not be in Visual Studio. Alternatively,
I've seen this happen before. This happened to me a while back. What was it?
Let me describe what the issue is. Let me see if I can reproduce it, because I know exactly what the issue is, but
I can't remember what it is. What was it? It's been bugging. Yeah, this happened to me.
Actually, I can go ahead and just simulate it.
It was wasn't it the duplicate? It was having two versions of Visual Studio on, wasn't it?
Possibly.
Well, I think that's what caused it for me.
Because
have you got 11 and 10 installed?
Me, no.
Or whatever they're calling it now, 2012 and 10?
No.
Cyrus?
Oh, him?
Yeah. No, Sean, sorry. The guy who asked the question we're answering.
Yeah, well, let me just really quickly show you guys. Here is an instance of Visual Studio that has not currently loaded a project. If I just click and drag finish line into this, you'll notice that because it's not attached to a project, it does not know how to highlight this stuff. In fact, I don't even get IntelliSense, or I get limited IntelliSense, very, very limited IntelliSense, which only includes keywords and templates. So the only thing that can be highlighted are keywords, and that's it. So I can't do manager dot because where's game manager? How does the IDE know where game manager is? And that's because I've opened this file up inside of a solution that hasn't loaded the project. However, if this file is open in a solution or in a window that is loaded this solution, or has loaded this solution, what we'll get is a proper syntax highlighting. Now, sometimes, I'm not entirely sure about when this happens, but I've seen it happen. Occasionally, you will manage to open up a file that is in your solution, but for some reason, Visual Studio doesn't make the connection, so it opens it up as if it wasn't. The solution to that problem is to close the file and reopen it from your Solution Explorer. You might have to sync your mono-develop project. So you might have to go into your project, right-click, and say Sync Mono-Develop Project.
See, we can't win for trying here. Now that we're explaining things and letting people catch up, we've got people going, oh, could we get on with the class, please? I don't know what to say, really. People have been on and on in the forums all week because we've been moving through this too fast and haven't explained what's going on. So we're explaining what's going on. Grab a cup of coffee, read a book. I don't know.
Well, let's see how much more we can get through today. All right, so now that I've created the finish line, I should be able to go ahead and fly through all my gates. And boom, I win. Now, I'm not going to worry about resetting the player yet. I do know that we are not resetting the player's position yet. That is going to be a topic for probably next week.
I think so, yeah. Because it does get more involved than you'd expect it to. Not particularly heavily involved, but it's not as easy as you'd at first think it is.
Yep. Alrighty, so that's it with the first section about the finish line. So let's talk about lives. Lives should be a very straightforward thing to go ahead and put together. I'm going to go ahead and jump into Game Manager, and I'm going to add in one public integer called starting lives. I'm actually going to place this down here, and I'm going to set it to 3. Then I'm going to add another public property called current lives. I'm going to reset everybody's ready check. Go ahead and get this property and this field added. We have a property called current lives, and we have a field called starting lives. Starting lives being initialized to 3. Okay, so while people are catching up on that, there's a little bit of more straightforward code to add in. I'm going to go ahead and jump into the player script. And so for anybody copying down, I'll leave that on the left. The player script is going to be fairly straightforward. All he's going to do is that when the player is destroyed, I'm going to say manager player lives, or sorry, current lives minus minus, or decrement. And then at the end of this coroutine, I'm going to say manager player points equals 0, reset their points to 0. Then I'm going to say if manager player or current lives is smaller or equal to 0, manager switch state new lose screen state manager. And then
So
yeah.
that was just yeah. So that's lines 41. 40. Oh, you just scrolled off screen.
Oh, hold on, I'm just getting this set up just a little bit. Oh, come on. I don't know why Visual Studio randomly decides not to let me dock like that. Okay, the final thing is that in playing game state, I'm going to change the render method to include lives. Which is simply going to say current lives. And I'm going to add in, as far as the positioning of this, obviously because that's relative or absolute screen space, I'm going to move the position of this to 20 pixels down in the Y direction. Alright, so as far as code that's been changed, I added the current lives and the player, or the starting lives, and initialized starting lives to 3.
That was in Game Manager.
Yes. And for the playing game state, I added a new label. And I'm also going to go ahead and add up here manager.current lives equals manager starting lives in the constructor. Then in player, I added some code at the end of the destroy ship coroutine, as well as some code above in the destroy player.
So yeah, now would be a good time to really check.
Yep. So I'm going to reset.
Guaranteed someone's going to get
everybody
missed something somewhere. And as to holding questions to the end, that sometimes works. It depends what the question is, because the thing is, if somebody's code isn't building now, you can't move on until it does, because, well, they're going to be stuck. And it's not just a question of, oh, well, we can come back and fix that one error later. That error will cause other things to not work, or may cause other things to not even build. And Unity will complain, actually. It'll say, you'll get a big flashing message every time you hit play saying, oh, there's compiler errors, fix them. It's in the nature of coding. You need to make sure it all works as you go along. In the same way as you want to be hitting Control-S a lot with whatever application you're using, you want to be hitting either Control-Shift-B or F6 to make sure you haven't introduced any dumb errors like misspellings or such like. It's far easier, and again, it's an extension of that, oh, well, I'll go back and fix it later. It doesn't work like that, because you end up with so many things that you always miss something, or you eventually go back and change things and then find that other things need changing. Well, that's it. We've intentionally, I realised you didn't mean any offence, but I did have to answer that, and then I realised that I actually couldn't think of anything that I could say on video in answer to it, because it's just one of those things. Now I've got that song in my head. But we intentionally actually made sure that we weren't covering a lot of ground in terms of coding this week, specifically because we knew we were going to have to answer questions and catch people up on things.
Exactly. Should probably pause. Alright, we're back. So now we should have lives. So let's go ahead and see if we can lose the game. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play. And notice how we have lives equal to 3 up there. Now lives equals to 2, and then I won because the game is too short. 2,
And also
1.
you're flying too fast, of course.
This game is too difficult to lose. Let's just bump this down to 20 for now. Alright, so let's die once. Lives 2, lives 1, lives 0, and we lose.
Do you just want to cover that whole why we put the actual transition to the lose state where we did?
Right.
If you remember what we were talking about before the lesson.
Yeah. When I saw this code initially, I would have written it a little bit different, but there is a good point as to why the bit that switches the state is at the end of the coroutine, as opposed to being an aspect of the destroy player method. And the reasoning is that by putting it in the coroutine, it opens up the possibility for something like playing an animation or doing some particle effects or some other thing to show the player being destroyed before actually performing the state transition, which of course will make the entire field of, well, play invisible.
Yeah, otherwise, if you did it before the start, or at the top of the coroutine, for instance, as soon as that contact, that collision was detected, boom, you would be straight into the lose screen.
Right. Okay. So now let's go ahead and look at importing the stuff that I sent everyone earlier today that I hope everybody has, because you need it. And if you don't have it, then, well, you're not going to be able to follow along. Okay, so I have a folder right here that contains JPEG and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 FPXs. I'm going to click and drag the JPEG into the textures folder and import that. Then I'm going to select all of the FBX files and click and drag them into the meshes folder. So all I did was I brought in the JPEG into the textures folder, and I brought in all the FBXs into the meshes folder. And that's really about it for now. Once you have that all set up, the next step is to go ahead. I'm going to delete this existing materials folder that was imported, because just like what we had before, I don't want to import the materials from the meshes themselves, from the FBX files. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to select every one of these meshes that I brought in. So that's new deck block, new deck frame, new deck sheet, new riser, new rotator. And I'm going to set their settings similar to what we did before in last class. The first thing is all of these meshes are going to get a scale factor of 1, because they were designed to be worked with in Unity with a scale factor of 1. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set their normal setting to calculate. I'm going to set their smoothing angle to 30. Keep in mind that I have every single one of these meshes selected.
The 5 you just brought in.
Yes. Then I'm going to uncheck import materials, because I don't want the materials from the FBX files. Then I'm going to set the animation from generation to don't import, because, well, these FBX files don't even have any animations in the first place. After setting all those settings, I can now hit apply, and all of the settings have been applied. So go ahead and hit ready if you have done all of those steps. 1 more minute if you're still working on those steps.
And so, yeah, that's actually why I deliberately chose to not bother with materials. And if actually you look at them closely, you'll find they aren't even UV'd properly.
How dare you.
Because, again, this is the point, though. These are very much this idea. These are animatics. These are placeholders that are about the right shape and size. You obviously, this at the same time, your modelers will be off making, a multi-million poly, high poly model to use as a UV map for the thing and so forth. So, import, Nelson?
No. It looks like everybody's just about done. So, yeah. So, the riser and the rotator, both of these we're going to be using mesh colliders with. We're not going to be using box colliders or any of the other primitive colliders. So to do that, I'm going to control click on both of these and say generate colliders and then hit apply. What that'll do is every time I instantiate any of these meshes, they'll come into play as a game object, of course, with the normal stuff on it, such as a mesh filter and a mesh renderer and all that fun stuff. But they'll also come into play with the mesh collider. And the mesh that's going to be used for the collider is, well, the meshes themselves. Now,
yeah. Now, sorry, I didn't. I was just going to say well, as you can tell, I mean, you look at this. A box collider isn't going to do it, and nor is any of the other primitives, because it's too complicated a shape for that. Now, you could go about. You could probably use a couple of different cylinder colliders on this, and an odd box here and there for sticky outy bits. It depends on how close you want to get. But when you tick that generate colliders box, what happens is that basically you can view that as like what they call in Photoshop actions. It's like a macro, because behind the scenes it adds a collider component of the type mesh collider actually, and in that collider, in fact, if you just select, if you just drop one into the scene, on either the riser or the rotator, doesn't really matter. I mean, drop it into the hierarchy. Not interested in what it looks like. It's the settings I want to see in the inspector. That mesh collider there has been generated for you because you checked generate collider. Not only that, the mesh field for the mesh collider, not the mesh itself, the field within the collider there, you can see it's assigned to turret riser, and it's basically just assigned the same mesh. Now, if you click on the radio button for that, Nelson, so it brings up the dialogue. Now you can see you have free choice of meshes that you can add. You could add the player mesh to the turret as a collider,
which would work.
And
it would just be a little awkward.
Yeah, it would mean collisions would happen on that. So it's no different. It's just another mesh. It just happens that in this case it sets it up for you and it uses the same mesh. Because these are animatics, these are about the complexity you would probably want your colliders to be. The riser one might be a bit overly finicky, but the turret rotator one, for instance, is that's about as complex as you would want it to be. Generate mesh collider is the third or fourth checkbox down in the import settings. Do you want to go back and show
Well, yeah,
me?
notice how I have a mesh selected.
You can close that window now. I've finished talking about it.
Notice how I have a mesh selected. Up here, there's a generate colliders checkbox. Yeah, like what Ironsoul pointed out, you can make a mesh in any modeling program that is simpler in poly count to what you render, but then use that as the mesh collider as opposed to the more complicated model.
And I mean, if I was taking this to its logical conclusion, I would actually start modeling the final model with the animatic model that's here. Because then, when in your modeling program, you've got the general sense of the volume you have to fill, and also you've got basically it's quite close to start with. This is like, but these are more modeling considerations than
Sure.
when you get to that point. And nowadays, certainly with a simple game like this, it's not really an issue, which is why we've just
No, certainly.
use the one that's there, because you simply don't have enough polys flying around to hurt you.
But an interesting thing to note is how much game development is truly the art of approximation. I don't know. I just find that funny. And cheating. Yeah, pretty much.
There is one other thing that needs to be done to the riser and rotator. Well, in fact, it needs to be done to all 5 of these.
Huh.
Which is on the colliders that we've... Well, see, it's on the colliders, but on the riser and rotator, where we've already created the colliders. Are we recording at the moment?
Yes.
Good. We need those two. We need the checkbox checked on the collider.
On the generate collider, you mean?
No, actually on the objects. On the colliders that it has generated. Oh, I suppose you can't... Sorry, I think I'm getting ahead of myself. You can't access that until you've... Yeah, sorry. I'll shut up. Ignore me.
Alrighty, and no, don't worry about adding in the new riser. I'm going to go ahead and delete this.
Yeah, that was just so that we could look at its settings.
Okay, so we pretty much got all of our meshes imported. We have 2 more things that we're going to be putting together here in this class. We're going to be constructing 2 prefabs, but I'm going to go ahead and pause the video and go. Okay, and we're back. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to go ahead and create some prefabs. So what I'm going to go ahead and do actually is I'm going to create a new scene to construct the prefabs in, and then I'll move them back into the, and then I'll delete that new scene, and yeah, you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, this is quite a good idea. Once you start getting to the point where you're putting a scene together, it's good to have a working scene, just in order to
Create prefabs and stuff.
Yeah, just so that you're not, because like here we're running into the fact that because the player is at the origin and that's where you want to be creating prefabs, it gets in the way of seeing what's going on, and yeah.
Right.
So
So I'm going to go to File, New Scene. I'm going to save the existing scene. Then I'm going to hit Control S and save this scene down to a scene called just Scratch. Just for now. Okay, so we're going to be creating a few prefabs. The first one we're going to be creating is a deck.
Oh, yeah, I will say, because you did it just automatically there. Once you've done that, double-click on your scratch scene, make sure that you're in your scratch scene, and that in your scene and game views you shouldn't see anything, and in hierarchy for that matter, you shouldn't see your stuff from the other scene. That's something that you do need to be careful of when you're opening Unity or switching between scenes. Just make sure that you're in the correct scene.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're going to be constructing some decks. So I'm going to go ahead and control-click on both of these guys to bring them into the hierarchy. Now, fortunately, they are already positioned correctly. What we have is that
these guys isn't a particularly helpful thing for those people who are trying to do it and follow along. He's brought in new deck block and new deck frame.
Mm-hmm.
And as he just demonstrated there, if you drag from the project into the hierarchy, they will come in at 0. As you can see, all they are a block and what's similar to, although not actually the same as, the gate components from earlier.
Yep. So if you notice that if I separate the two, we'll get this. So I'm going to position them both in the origin. I'm also going to go ahead and keep the rotation at -90 for the X.
Yeah, this is an import thing to do with Y up and Z up, that you'll get used to the fact that increments of 90 will randomly appear in your rotations. Yeah, you just kind of have to live with it and learn to recognize the symptoms, really.
Yep.
Continue.
So now that we have these guys in, I'm going to go ahead and create a new game object. So I'm going to go to game object create empty.
I would, yeah. We're going to call that deck small. If you create, before you do that, I was going to say, if you do the colliders first.
Right, so what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to give both block and frame colliders so that they can collide with the player. I'm going to give them both box colliders.
In actual fact, for this, I would just give the frame a box collider. Because if you think about it, well, the block sits entirely within the same box volume as the frame does. So you don't really need two colliders there. And actually it might cause some problems because it's possible that when an update occurs, your ship could be colliding with both of them, depending on how fast it's moving, and then you'll lose 2 lives.
Right.
Possibly. You're introducing problems for yourself. So I do the deck frame because it's slightly larger, by like not very much.
Yeah, so I'm going to click on New Deck Frame, go to Component, Physics, Box Collider, and give it a handy little box collider.
Now, there's a few things in the box. Well, first of all, make sure that you check, first off, is trigger,
Yep.
so that it's selected. Now, I just want to point out the sizes that are on it, 5.1, 5.1, 1.1. The reason that they are like that is because, well, Unity is quite clever in that regard. It recognised that that is the bounding volume of the object you created. Basically, that is the smallest box that is oriented to the world, i.e. not rotated at all. That's the smallest size of box that will fit inside it, whatever you are creating a box collider for. This is probably easier to see over on the player because it's not a box shape, and yet it does that. But yeah, the key thing is make sure that you click is trigger and check that checkbox there.
I'm going to change this to 5.1 just to fix my OCD a little bit.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so now that our new deck block and new deck frame are configured, I'm going to move them both under deck small, and then I'm going to give deck small a rigid body.
Before no. Right, undo. Take them off again. It's because of the way you do things. Select deck small. Okay, don't do anything. No. Oh, okay. I was going to ask people to spot what you hadn't done.
Oh. What haven't I done?
That is a key thing.
What haven't I done?
Thank you, Engage. Yes. Always make sure that you know. I was almost going to say that you position things at 0, but make sure you know where you've positioned things. This is why, as Wolf 90 pointed out, Nelson's gates didn't line up with the player when he was creating them, was because they're off-centered. How did I know what? Oh, they knew that because he'd already done it once on the screen. I wasn't quick enough in stopping him. Okay, and yeah, you should be good to go now.
Okay, so now I'm going to waiting for validation.
Yes, you may do it.
Now I'm going to go ahead and parent both of these onto the deck small. And then I'm going to give deck small a rigid body. Then I'm going to modify his rigid body to not use gravity. And then I'm going to check this property.
It's kinematic.
And that ensures that our decks won't just fall forever. And that we can properly update them directly through the transform and not through a physics simulation.
Yeah, this is just the same as we did before, and we'll be doing this again in a minute to other things. So, yeah, plenty of practice at doing this. The one thing I know it's kind of Nelson always in a hurry to put things in their hierarchical position, and I'm always not, is because I've played around with Unity for a bit longer than Nelson has. Always leave the actual game object that is going to house all the elements of your prefab to the last thing. That way you don't have to worry about local scales, positions and rotations when you're setting it up. And you can, yes, you'll be left with a nice game object, or you'll be left with a prefab that is in the right place in rotation and scale.
Okay, so then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to introduce a new script for our decks. and those scripts will make it so that our decks will appropriately kill the player if they run into it. So I'm going to go down to scripts, hit create, C# script, and I'm going to call this deck.
Oh my. Did I do that?
No. But that's why it wasn't working.
Oh. You have no idea how long and in what temperatures I spent trying to work out why that wasn't working. Oh.
So anyway, now I'm going to fire...
Sorry. A little bit of behind the scenes there. No, seriously, oh, that went wrong.
Okay, so I'm going to create a deck that inherits from mono behavior and implements okay, hold on. I'm going to close this file. Whoa. I'm going to close this file and open it back up. There we go. Implements iGame entity. And when it collides with the player, simply we'll say player.destroyPlayer. And that's it. So, jumping back into Unity.
Give people a couple of seconds because we'll only have to show it again otherwise. I'm learning, you see. Hindsight, that just looks like your keyboard needs replacing. Okay. Anyone who hasn't copied that down by now probably needs typing lessons as well. You should do a typing course.
Become a programmer.
Yeah, learn to type. It really is. Yeah. Cool. Okay, carry on.
Okay, so then I'm going to go ahead and attach the deck script to our deck small. Actually, I'm not going to. I'm actually going to attach the deck script to our deck frame, which is what has the collider on
it. Scott, you could copy and paste that. The key point being that this isn't a gate. And I can't drive this home strongly enough. Naming things is important, because as we were having that discussion earlier about this seems like a lot of code for not very much, and is it or not? But if you don't keep track of names, a prime example being Nelson's Gates in the other scene at the moment, because they're just called Gate. So knowing which one's which in which order, you have no way except to actually go through and click on them and see where they appear to be in the scene. So. This isn't a gate script. It's not doing that. It's coincidence in this case that they have the same coding. Now, if that cropped up a lot across and you found that you're making lots and lots of differently named things that all had the same functionality in, well, okay, yes, they might all want to be the same script, but in that case it wouldn't be a gate script. It would be a collision check script. But anyway, yes.
Alrighty, so now that we have our gate, our deck small created, I'm going to go ahead and click and drag this game object into our prefabs. And, well, now I have a gate small.
Voila.
Which is super exciting. So let's go ahead and make a gate medium and a gate large. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to go ahead and disassociate this prefab by clicking on game object and saying break prefab instance. Then I'm going to rename this to deck medium. After renaming it, I'm going to go ahead and scale not the game object itself, because you kind of want your prefabs to stay at a scale of 1, 1, 1 to make math easier, but I'm going to go ahead and scale up both of its internal game objects by a factor of 2.
Actually, it was 2 in X and Y and 1 in Z. Now, again, this comes back to the reason that we have the game object that is called deck medium over the top. Look at the scales that we now have on this, Does anyone see a problem? Or not a problem, but an oddity?
No, collision looks fine.
Now, specifically I've specifically look at the scales of the transform. They're not in ratio anymore, but that's only part of the thing. C.E. Hayes, I think, has got it. We have scaled in X and Y by 2. But hang on, Y is up in Unity. Well, this comes down to the rotation of this particular sub-object, which is rotated at minus 90. So Y becomes, X and Y are now across and Z is up. If you rotate that around to 0, yeah. So this is what I was saying before about you can get incredibly confusing, essentially, in terms of which things go in which direction. And there's a certain amount of doing what Nelson's doing there and dragging things around until you work out which axis you're dealing with, and then undoing it and replacing with the values you want. Sorry, I just thought I'd bring that up because it is well, A, people will get confused by it, and B,
Yeah, it is slightly
it's a good
counterintuitive.
example of the odd way you have, and it is something you just kind of have to get used to, not just with Unity, with modelling in general when you're dealing with local rotations and scales and movements for that matter. Bye, Ben. Cool. Also notice that because we only did that to the sub-objects, the deck medium, the actual parent object, is oh, you've taken mouse control away.
Huh?
Come back to the lesson, Nelson.
I am here.
Whatever
I'm
you're
just,
playing
I'm
with.
letting you, I mean, deck medium.
Yes, its scale and rotation and position are all still neutral, sort of identity defaults.
Okay, so now that we have our deck medium, I'm going to click and drag this into prefabs, and now we have a deck medium prefab. Just to repeat this one more time, I'm going to go ahead up to game object, say break prefab instance, create a deck large, and I'm going to scale all of these to 3 in X and Y for both of these game objects. After doing that, I'll just create another prefab out of it. So now we have a deck large, medium, and small.
Woot.
Yay. So now I'm going to go ahead and delete this out of my hierarchy, and I'm going to jump back into code. Or sorry, into our scene 1.
Snishes? Oh, right, okay, yeah.
Then I'm going to go ahead and place I'm going to go ahead and just place a deck large right there, and place it a little bit ahead of the player, and see if we can go ahead and collide with it. So now when I hit run, of course, people paying attention would note that this deck large has to be parented with segment 1. You guys don't have to follow through with this, by the way. I just want to show everybody it working. So now when I hit play, and I run into the deck, notice how I lost a life. So just to show that again, if I run into the deck, boom, I lose a life. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the deck again. And yeah, so that was just a quick run through for prefab creation.
Well, that was basically just, yeah, and then checking that it did what we thought it did, which is always, again, as I was saying, it comes back to not leaving things to do. Don't say, all right, when I've done all of these, I'll check that I'm doing it right. Because you'll get to the end, like I did, and find that you hadn't done it right, and none of them collided with anything. Large was set to 3, 3, instead of 2 and 2.
Yep.
No, he only checked it once because he hadn't changed the relevant settings, i.e. anything to do with collision and so forth. between large, medium, and small, they were all the same. So it didn't matter. It shouldn't matter which one you picked.
Right. So is everybody good with the decks? We aren't really
Anyone who's
using...
not good with the decks, please hit 1 more minute or something.
Yeah. We aren't using these immediately. I just wanted to have the opportunity to show everybody a few tricks about prefab creation. But though we will be using them.
We're about to make another prefab, apart from anything else, so
Yeah.
it's best to just stick with that for now before... Because basically, where you put them is up to you. That's when you have to take your game maker's hat off and put your level designer's hat on and say, well, what makes an interesting level? Big play. Yes. Oh, yes. No. There will be BFGs. We're about to. In fact, we're about to make. We're about to make an SFG. A small player killing gun.
Okay. So we are slightly running out of time here, so let's go ahead and jump right into the turrets, because the turrets is, again, this is just going to be another prefab creation, but it's also going to be a little bit of code. So I'm going to go ahead and jump back into our other scene called Scratch to go ahead and construct a turret. Well, a turret is just really going to be a riser and a rotator, and a other thing,
Deck frame.
and the frame. And with the riser and the rotator and the frame combined, we'll get a nice little turret. Now, the reason that these are kind of created separately is so that they can move independently from each other. So you'll see now it looks kind of...
Hands up who knows what each one does.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to stop.
So, you know, we can have the little guy rise up to, or rise up or down if the player's appearing. We can go ahead and have it rotate by grabbing the rotator, and we get this nice little rotation doohickey thing. So it's the reason that these are all different objects is so that we can move them in different positions, regardless of what each other is. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to jump back into all of the rotations and transforms and move them back to 0 for now, because I was kind of toying with them a second ago.
And incidentally, even when you think it's come in at 0, it's always worth checking to make sure it hasn't come in at like 1.2 times e to the minus 7 million, i.e. nearly 0. Make sure it is exactly 0.
Yep. Okay, so then what I'm going to do is I'm going to, make sure that everything's set to 0. I'm going to create a new game object, an empty game object. I'm going to call this turret small. Then I'm going to make sure that our turret small... Yes, that's what I was doing. That's what I was doing. I'm going to make sure that the turret small game object is positioned at the origin. And then I'm going to create a little hierarchy out of this. So I'm going to start with putting the frame in turret small. Then I'm going to move the rotator into turret small. Then I'm going to move the riser into the rotator.
Incidentally, I've just realised we did actually have a new deck sheet in there as well. But
we can go ahead and grab that in too. So to go ahead and import a new deck sheet, I'm going to move this new deck sheet mesh over into the hierarchy. And I'm going to...
That's where it should be, really.
You mean up here?
No, where I put it.
I'm just going to keep that at the origin as well. And then I'm going to move the new deck sheet into the turret small. So this is our neat little prefab that we have here. There's one interesting aspect to this, though. We're going to have to create a script. Now, I'm not going to write out the entirety of the script yet, because the entirety of the script, to test the entirety of the script, is going to require us to be an actual game, which obviously we can't simulate in this scene. But I will do the amount of the code that we need to write in the script to attach it to the prefab and to get a few things set up with the prefab. Of course, I do have to go ahead and get some basic colliders working for the different objects. So the only objects that I'm going to really worry about having a collider is going to be the frame, like before, where we talked about. So I'm going to go ahead and say component physics box collider, and give our frame a box collider. Then I'm going to give the rotator and the riser. Notice how the rotator and the riser both already have mesh colliders. That's because of the import setting that we specified within the mesh. That being said, the setting of whether or not it's a trigger unfortunately cannot be set within the settings of the import of the mesh. So we're going to have to manually select is trigger on each one of our mesh colliders, as well as the box collider that we just dragged into the system. So now that we have all this done, I'm going to go ahead and create a new script. I'm going to create two scripts. I'm going to create a script for colliding with a turret, and I'm going to apply that on everything that has a mesh collider on it. And then, of course, we're going to have to add a rigid body, but I'll go ahead and build the script out first. Well, I mean, I can just go ahead and... Turret small is going to require a rigid body to properly work with the collision, which is a matter of simply clicking on turret small, going to component, physics, rigid body, unchecking gravity, and checking this property.
Just more of the same, really.
Yeah, pretty much exactly what we did with the other thing. And keep in mind that stuff like this is really easy to forget.
Oh, you see, now I was going to let it go. I had to remind him to do the colliders in the questions panel, and I had to remind him to do the rigid body in the questions panel. I was being all polite and doing it behind the scenes, but no, these are easy to forget. Nelson just forgot to do both of it.
Yeah, well, and yeah, any sort of thing like this, and it's just a matter of practice. And it's not only that; it's also a matter of when something fails, just enumerate the steps in your mind. Like, did I do this? Did I do that? Did I do that? Because you will forget things inevitably. That's especially when there's so many check boxes and dragging and dropping and stuff like that involved.
Yeah.
Okay, so now that we have a turret small here, I'm going to create a script for colliding with a turret. First of all, and I'm going to apply that to each one of the game objects that have a collider. Then I'm going to create another script that will represent the turret as a whole. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a new C# script called turret collider. And I'm going to jump into Visual Studio. And not surprisingly, I'm going to give this code pretty much the same behavior that we saw before with our decks. So, as you see right here, for one reason or another, Alt-Shift-Space results in a menu popping up in my Visual Studio as opposed to what it should do. So to fix that, I'm going to close out of this file and reopen it. Now that I have it reopened, I can successfully hit Control-Alt-Space and type in game entity. After doing that, I'll...
Control-Alt or Control-Shift? You said one each time.
Alt-Shift-Space, sorry. So here's your turret collider. All it'll do is destroy the player, and that's it. So I'm going to jump back into Unity, and I'm going to apply the turret collider to our new rotator, our new riser, and our new frame. So to verify, if I click on New Deck Frame, you'll notice a turret collider script attached to it, as well as the rotator and the riser. Now I'm going to go ahead and create another script. I'm not going to implement this in its entirety quite yet, because this will be a bit of code that we'll have to write out. But I will implement it to the extent that we need it to be in order to successfully create our prefab. I'm going to call this script turret. And I'm going to open it up. And preemptively, I'm going to close the file and reopen it, because it'll probably mess up again like I did before. Now, the only bits that the turret cares about is the turret's going to need to be able to access the riser and the rotator. There's the only real two things that I want to worry about even creating first. We'll add a few more properties in later, but these are the only ones that are going to be necessary to create our prefabs. So I'm going to say public game object riser, public game object rotator. By adding these two properties to the field,
Pardon?
oh, sorry, a question just came in. By adding these two properties, wow, did I say by adding these two properties to a field? Because I meant to say by adding these two fields to a class, we are able to associate our turret object with two other game objects. So now I'm going to jump back into Unity, and I'm going to drag turret onto turret small. Then, within turret small, I'm going to click and drag a new rotator onto our rotator game object, and new riser onto our riser game object. Now, before anybody says anything, Unity is actually fairly intelligent when it comes to prefabs. Because I've associated these two game objects to a script that's within the prefab, every time I instantiate this prefab, those two game object references won't reference the same riser and rotator. They'll reference the riser and rotator that were instantiated along with the rest of the prefab. So it's a very nice little feature of Unity that makes prefab creation easier.
Yeah, this is one of those things where if that doesn't make any sense to you, I'd just let it go by you for now, because it is kind of a finicky point of, it's something that coders will immediately go, well, that's weird, but it should, they're all going to end up pointing to the same thing. Unity deals with that. So if you understand what problem he's talking about, that's the explanation. If you don't understand that problem, just take it for
granted.
Take it as read. But you just want to very briefly just show the line of code that I had put in, being unaware of that fact.
Yeah.
Because it makes the explanation clearer, I think.
Well, previously, the code looked something like this, where both the riser and the rotator, there was two scripts, turret riser and turret rotator, that didn't have anything on them, but were attached to the game object of riser and rotator. And this is actually a valid way to look in yourself, to do some self-discovery within your own transforms children, and find if any of the game objects that you contain, or any of the game objects that you parent, contain or have implemented a particular mono behavior. So that was the original implementation. Basically, every time this turret was started, it would reach into itself and find the children that implemented these two mono behaviors, which is certainly a valid implementation for a lot of different problems. Obviously, not every problem can be handled with this particular feature of Unity. So this is something that's interesting to keep in mind if it ever becomes an issue where you need to reach into either yourself or another game object and find components or game objects within that parent game object that have these components on them.
Cool. So kill that.
All right. So blah 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 blah. Okay. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn turret small into a prefab, which is simply a matter of clicking and dragging to the prefabs folder. We now have a turret small. Finally, I'm going to delete turret small from our scratch scene because our scratch scene is really just that. And I'm going to jump into our other scene, and I'm going to verify that our collision is working properly. So that's just going to be a matter of going under prefabs. So notice how I'm now in the main scene. I'm going to jump into prefabs, go to turret small. I'm going to add an instantiation of turret small to segment 1. Move it forward a little bit. You guys don't have to do this. Again, I'm just verifying that this code works in case I did something dumb or forgot something. Again. So now that that's added to the segment, I'm going to go ahead and try to run into it. And as you may have seen, I don't know what the frame rate's like, I was able to run into the turret. My lives were
We can see the lives counter.
You what?
I was just going to say we can see the lives counter.
My lives are decremented and so on.
Excellent.
Okay, so that's our turret small. The final bit of this particular class is going to be implementing the logic for our turret small, and that's going to be inside of our turret. However, I do feel that we're actually a little bit before when I would typically go on and take a break. But I think that this would be a good place to stop for now.
Because then we can get through the code after break, and then that'll be it.
I'll go ahead and make sure. I don't know how you lost keyboard control, but here you go. I have keyboard control. And then I'm going to go ahead and pause. And we're back. We got a few interesting questions. One of those is, what do people notice about my turret small prefab? Does anybody notice anything off or strange about it? Come on, anyone? Anyone?
Bueller?
Yeah, exactly. There's no new riser. And for some reason, possibly because my roommate is watching Arrested Development upstairs, that makes me think of Maggie Lizer. So turret small has no new riser parented to the new rotator. But if I go ahead and instantiate it by dragging it over, notice how it does. So the view within this particular turret small in the project window is going to be different from when you instantiate it. You're not going to see game objects that are nested multiple levels deep. Necessarily. And then the other question that came in is, where should the riser be parented to? The answer is the riser should be parented to the rotator. And if you think about it, that makes sense. The riser moves it up, and then the rotator rotates it. And the rotator should rotate the riser because the riser includes, as you'll notice, the actual turrety bit.
Oh, you know what we haven't put on that?
Yeah, I don't... Well...
Are we getting this week or not? No, we can leave it off for this week.
Yeah, we'll do that next week. Once we actually get it shooting things. Okay.
Yay.
So I'm going to delete the turret small. And then I'm actually going to re-add it back because I wanted it here. And I'm going to place it within segment 1. So I now have a turret small within segment 1. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm going to be testing a feature that we're going to be implementing. So I'm going to move the turret forward a little bit. I'm just eyeballing this. I want to move it past the first gate. The only important thing to note here is that the turret is instantiated, it is in our scene, and it is parented to our segment 1, so it'll move along with the star field. So let's go ahead and write the code on our turret script. Notice how...
Well, actually, yeah, I was going to say, if you just zoom into that in the view, does anyone notice anything slightly odd other than the vertical position of the guns? As somebody pointed that out in BuzzNet just now, that the guns are inside it. They're actually pointing away from the player. Yes, Florin nailed it. Basically, the way this turret is going to work is it's going to look for the player to come near it. When the player gets within range, it's going to activate itself, and the turret, the middle section, is going to move up so it's into firing position, and the rotator is going to rotate through 180 degrees. That's our basic activating, it's getting ready to fire stuff. So, yeah.
The turret and turret collider attached to the new riser. The turret script is attached to the turret prefab itself, as you see right here. The riser is parented to the rotator, and the rotator is parented to the turret. Now, the rotator and the riser and the frame all have the turret collider script on it, not the turret script. They're two different scripts. That's because the turret script is going to sort of orchestrate the entire workings of the turret, whereas the turret collider scripts are going to deal with what happens when a player hits a particular part of a turret, determined by the box collider or mesh collider on this game object.
Essentially, it's like a little turret manager as compared to our game manager, which manages the whole game and dealing with that. The turret script itself deals with anything that the turret needs to deal with.
Yep. All right, let's go ahead and jump in and write code. So,
yay!
I'm going to jump into the turret script. Few interesting things that I'm going to need. First of all, I'm going to need a game manager. To get a game manager, I'm going to simply follow the same conventions that we've been doing before. I'm going to say manager equals game object find game manager dot get component game manager. Notice really quickly how I did not actually implement this field first. That's because by hitting Alt page up, my keyboard cursor appears on this bit of red. Then by hitting Alt enter, down down enter, I now get a field. So again, that's just a nice little feature of ReSharper for code generation. Basically, all I've done at this point is added a private game manager field, as well as a line of code in the start method that actually locates the game manager and extracts its component.
Cool.
Now there's a few other things that we need. We need to get the player. So I'm going to say player equals gameObject.find player. I'm going to do the same thing. Alt page up, Alt enter, down down enter. So now we have another field called player. That's, well, the game object of the player. Keep in mind that the turret is going to wait to be in proximity of the player before rising up and rotating to the player. Then I'm going to go ahead and add in a few interesting things. I'm going to start with some more public fields, first of all. We're going to want to be able to configure the turret in certain ways. So I'm going to say public float activation range equals 50F. Or, well, just 50 because there's an implicit conversion between ints and floats. But regardless, we'll have an activation range. That'll be when does this turret begin activation. Then I want an activation time. And I'm going to give this 2. And the activation time is the amount of time it takes for the turret to rise up and point towards the player. Then I'm going to give a...
Well, just before we move on, because somebody was talking, Flash was talking in BuzzNet, said, I think a trigger volume would work. And we said, somebody else was saying, are we using Retcast or Collider or what? In actual fact, as you can see, we're not using a trigger volume for that. This is, A, this is more flexible, and B, this actually makes your life easier when you're setting up, potentially hundreds of these turrets. You don't have to then set up volumes for them as well. This is easier, really, conceptually. If you don't know anything about Unity or other programs and so forth, this is probably easier to follow than having to explain about trigger volumes and more checkboxes and stuff. But yeah, that you could do it like that. Sorry, carry on. I wanted to address that while it was still on my screen.
Okay, so yeah. So we'll have our activation time and our activation range, and we'll also have a riser inactivity position Y of 0. That will be what constitutes the riser being inactive, which is going to be a position of 0 in the Y component. Then I'm going to give a riser active position Y of 1. When the turret becomes active, we want a riser to increase its Y component to 1. Then I'm going to do a rotator inactive rotation Y equals 0. Same sort of thing, but for rotation, for our rotator, which should make sense. And then a rotator active rotation Y, which will simply be 180 degree, or 180 units. And that will...
Okay, this is bugging me. Line 11.
Line 11.
Can you change that so it matches up with the rest of them? Inactive, not inactivity. I don't know where you got that from.
Oh, so picky today, Gavin.
What do you mean today?
All right, so then I'm going to go ahead and give it a few more private fields. I'm going to say private float lerpt. If I can spell lerpt. And we'll talk about that in a moment. That's going to be used for sort of generating a nice transition effect as the player comes into view. The final private field I'm going to give it is actually going to be of a type that we haven't defined yet. I'm going to go ahead and create a value objects namespace within code. So as you see,
And that's Sorry, go on.
Yeah, as you see, I've just created a new folder underneath code, and then I'm going to add an enumeration to it called activation mode. Now, currently, the only thing that can be activated are turrets, because that's the only script that we're going to be writing that takes advantage of this sort of stuff. But in the future, it's very much possible that we are going to be using other, or writing other game objects that are capable of having different states of activation. So we're going to sort of, factor that out into a nice little enumeration for us to reuse in the future. The only one...
Yeah, I mean, an example of that would be something like, doors that open.
Right.
Or, tanks that suddenly start moving off.
Right.
Anything like that.
So I'm going to give it a few members. I'm going to give it an inactive member. All of this should be fairly straightforward. An activating member, an active member, and a dead member. And these are the only members that we're going to worry about for now because they're the only ones we're going to be using for our turret implementation. I'm going to leave this code on the side here and go into full screen so you guys can copy down the enum while I work on other stuff. But basically all I'm going to do is add in an activation mode into our private fields. Now, I do want to point out very, very clearly in language that is as clear and concise and bold as I could possibly state it using the English language and the constraints in my own voice. A using statement just appeared on line 1, using assets, code, value, objects. Okay, so now that we've gotten over that, let's go and write some more code. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do actually is initialize our local Euler angles to the inactive position for our rotator. Keep in mind that our rotator is currently available to us by the rotator field that's provided by the Unity inspector. So I can simply do rotator.transform.local Euler angles equals new vector 3. And I'm going to pass in 0 and then rotator inactive y, or rotator inactive rot y, and then 0 in the z component. So that's going to initialize it to the local,
to the values that we set.
Right, exactly.
Make sure you're using local Euler angles, because there is a rotator.transform.Euler angles as well. They are global. And this again comes back to what we showed earlier with that oddity in scaling. These angles that are local, it's personal calculations depending on which way it's facing, as opposed to the global ones, which are just the actual ones in the world.
Right. If anybody here is a web developer, think about the difference between the CSS property of position. Think about the difference between if you position an element with the relative attribute or if you position an element with the absolute attribute. That's again, just throwing that out there for web devs because that's pretty much exactly what it is.
That's the most strained analogy in the first place.
It's not a strained analogy.
He says
it's for the web developer.
We had this question that came in that said, what is an Euler angle? But then the same person asked, and who is Euler? So he guessed that there was a person. So you're halfway there. They are angles in the same way as XYZ positions are Cartesian coordinates named after Descartes. These are Euler angles, which are your X, Y, and Z rotation. That is as opposed to a thing called a quaternion, which is a horrible thing, and we will not be getting to that, if at all possible, in the 101 class, because they're horrible. And in actual fact, there are quite a number of utility methods that in the Unity namespaces for dealing with rotation and such like that are specifically there to avoid having to calculate quaternions for yourself. Musa said, named after Alexander Quaternion. Fantastic. No, they're called quaternions because they have X, Y, Z and W components. But anyway, yes, beyond the scope, I'm afraid. Google and Wikipedia for those will frighten you. They literally are the how you think of rotation in space.
In real space.
In the normal course of things.
And the only space that we will be talking about in this particular Unity 101.
Remember, with Euler angles, these they are rotations around the relevant axis. So the y-axis, which points straight up, if you want something to spin around that, like a merry-go-round, you need to set the y rotation because you're rotating around y. If you were making a Ferris wheel, you'd rotate around x. Anyhow.
Okay, so let's go ahead. We have a little bit more code to write. I'm going to go ahead and create a method called update. And the method update is simply going to be a glorified state machine, and it's going to delegate off into different methods. And this is simply a matter of code cleanliness. It's not necessary that I break these out into different methods, but breaking things out into different methods typically produces significantly more easier to read code than otherwise. So I'm going to do a switch on our activation mode. And then I'm going to have ReSharper generate all of the cases for me. For each one of these cases, depending on which activation mode we are in, I want to delegate into a method. So I'm going to have an update inactive method. I'm going to have an update activating method. I'm going to have an update active method. And I'm going to have an update dead method.
I know you hate it. Go ahead and explain why you've done what you've done, layout-wise. Because people will be wondering why you aren't doing the norm.
I have a particular bit of personal preference.
Hatred?
A particular bit of hatred, I suppose you could say, of switches, in that I don't like the amount of vertical screen space that they use. I don't like their limitations, and I find them all around fairly obnoxious. But I do have one concession, or one caveat to that, is if I'm writing a switch statement that only has single statement bodies, I will move them all onto the same line of code so that I don't waste vertical screen space.
Conceptually, this should make sense to everyone. This is a more compact, like Nelson said, it's basically a state machine.
Exactly.
We have our activation mode, which is our state of being, and then we've got different updates happening depending on which one we're currently in.
And simply a matter of code organization. It's not so much that if I were to have put the implementation of each one of these methods into that switch statement that it wouldn't work. It would just be completely ridiculously, stupidly, ugly, limiting, and annoying. So splitting everything out into methods increases the readability significantly. Further, there's one thing that I'm missing here, actually. Can anybody guess what bit I am missing? Can anybody guess a potential bug in my code? Something that I shouldn't miss? Yep, and a lot of people got it. I forgot to set the default of my activation mode. And fortunately, ReSharper has told me that activation mode is never assigned. I'm going to initialize my activation mode to inactive. Another ReSharper trick. Notice how when I hit equals, and all I had to do was type in inactive. Notice by typing in inactive, because it knows that we're assigning it to a enumeration with a member called inactive, it shows that option as the first member of the IntelliSense, something that Visual Studio does not do.
Also, people will have given that answer because they were expecting a default case in the switch. But because we know, in fact we can even see it on the screen at the moment, we have made an activation mode that has those 4 activation states. And we have dealt, or we will be, but in terms of the switch, we have dealt with each of the available states. Now, yes, normally you would have a default case, throwing an invalid operation exception. But there really isn't any need for it in this case. And you will get the same. The thing is, this will now, if you were to add another activation mode to your enum, like deactivating, say you had to do something after active but before dead, then until you actually ran the game, you wouldn't actually, the code would compile because, well, it's got a default and it will throw an exception. However, if you if you didn't put the default there, you'd get errors instead of exceptions. Is the short way of. I don't want to go too deep into that. But.
Okay, so let's go ahead and work on our update inactive. Update inactive. The code that I'm about to write should look very straightforward to people. Platter. Freudian slip. I'm kind of hungry. Pop, pop. If anybody gets what I just said, I'll give them a cookie.
Let me guess. Ponies?
Not directly, no.
So yes, this code basically just says, well, it gets the length, it gets the position of the player and the position of itself, and finds the magnitude of the distance between them, i.e. how far that is. Essentially, a sphere is checked of the activation range radius. Well, no, we don't want to know about the square magnitude. We want to know about the magnitude. Square magnitude is for when you're doing. I mean, we could check that against the activation range squared. If you were going to do that, you would have to do player transform position minus transform position, all in one. Dot square magnitude is less than or equal to activation range times activation range. That is slightly more efficient. Well, it's quite a bit more efficient, but we're not doing, a bazillion of.
All right, so let's go ahead and jump into our activating case, which is simply going to be lerpt plus equals time delta time divided by activation time. That should be fairly straightforward to people. We are, I don't know what else to say about that. But finally, what we're going to have to go ahead and do is, now that we have this lerpt field, which is sort of a progression of, and think about it as an animation, really. I mean, it's not an animation in the sense of animations within Unity, but it is an animation in the sense of we are actually animating something over a period of frames. So lerpt is going to be a value between 0 and 1 that's going to allow us to know, or allow us to calculate where our positions of both our rotator and our riser need to be on a particular frame based off of a calculation of delta time.
Okay, as an example, say this was going to happen over 3 frames. You would have it at 0 on the first frame, the frame where it starts, and at 1 on the last frame. That frame in between you'd obviously need the position of it to be, well, halfway in between the beginning and the end. That is a standard sort of average of the two. You go, add the beginning and the end and divide by 2. So what lerping is rather than just taking a mean of 2 values is, i.e. an average of 2 values, is a specific type of lerp. You're lerping but at a value of 0.5. What we're doing here is basically changing that point using time.delta time. You can use other things to do that. You could use, the color of the background that it was passing over. You could use its position in, anything you want. But we're using time.delta time to smoothly change over time the position between 0 and 1. Lerp, the operation is, which Nelson's about to type out.
Yeah, I can go ahead and type that out.
It's what's the word? Locked,
Well,
limited. It's constrained
exactly.
to 0 and 1. It actually says so in the documentation for it.
Well, look at the parameters. We have from and to and t. T is going to be a value between 0 and 1 that indicates the time, I suppose you could say, even though it's not directly related to time, between the transition from to to. So when t is 0, the value that's returned by lerp is from. When t is 1, the value that's returned from lerp is 2. When t is 0.5, the value that's returned by lerp is halfway between from and to. So that's how we can achieve smoother animations.
And Stephen said, so this is an interpolation. Yes, in fact, it's a linear interpolation. An interpolation would be mathf.erp, I suppose. The ERP stands for interpolation in this case. It's linear interpolation between two values. You've got an error there.
I know.
I may have... Okay.
I know.
No, you just had me worried because I spotted it but thought, I wonder if I did that wrong out of copy and pastiness. This isn't something that people will be able to guess because there's no particularly good reason for it. Line 56, mathf.lerp angle, I think it's called.
56 lerp angle? What?
You shouldn't be doing lerp for that one. It's a rotation. You should be using lerp angle.
Derp. So obviously this is going to be...
There's a bug.
Yeah. I thought you were talking about the fact that I passed it 0 for the lerp parameter.
No.
Which was also a bug.
Lerp angle, for those of you wondering, it's actually, I believe it's exactly the same as lerp, except it does a range check for the angle output to keep it between 0 and 360. I wouldn't swear 100% to that, but I'm fairly certain that's the only difference. It does the same thing, but it also makes sure that you're wrapping around doing a modulus at 360.
Okay, we have 2 more to go ahead and deal with. So our update active is going to go ahead and we're not going to actually write out this code. Basically, it's going to track the player, and then it's going to fire missiles at the player. The update dead is going to be the concept of our activation of our thing being deactivated. And I really want to point out here, though, I did actually kind of mess up in our enumeration declaration. We need our active, our dead, but we also need our deactivating.
See, and I kind of dropped it in earlier to see whether it would trigger you to change it, but I thought you might have decided to change it given...
Given what, Gavin?
Given the time.
Yeah. Well, no, I completely just forgot about it. So I added a deactivating member to our activation mode. So I'm going to add another case statement for deactivating. That's simply going to say update deactivating.
I was about to tell you to change something that doesn't exist.
Why can't I type tonight? I think my keystroke quota has been expended for the day. Okay, so our update deactivating method is now being invoked when our activation mode is set to the deactivating member of the enum, which, of course, is an enum member that I just added after the fact. So our update deactivating method, basically what this is going to do is the opposite of what our activating method does. So it's basically going to be the same thing.
Some of the opposite.
Yeah, well, yeah, we're still going to do our lerping like this. But then we're going to go ahead and have our riser, Maggie Lizer. I can't get her out of my head right now. We're going to go ahead and do a mathf.lerp, and then we're going to lerp kind of backwards. We're going to lerp from our riser active pos y to our riser inactive pause y, and we're going to pass in our lerpt field to that.
And I know you said it already, but I will go back and make absolutely sure that people remember line 62 of your code.
Yeah, exactly. So then I'm going to say if lerpt is smaller than 1, return. Otherwise, set lerpt to 0 and set our activation mode to dead.
Dead. Now, people might be saying, because I actually did this to myself initially, well, why don't we just destroy it? If it's, it's dead now, we can destroy it, and then we won't be updating it or anything like that. But of course, you do still want it to be there. You want something to be there. You might be swapping out for a different mesh that's wreckage, or you might just have, like it sat, as we are going to do for now, just have it deactivate and sit there. But you don't just want to destroy the game object, because obviously you still need, for a certain level of realism, some remnant of it to still exist.
Nope.
So, yeah.
All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and jump into Unity and see what our turret does. So let's watch our turret.
And, yeah, dead's not going to do anything.
Hey.
You're going to want to slow this down a lot. Hey, it worked. It rotated. Except you've got odd rotations occurring.
I think it's rotating on the wrong axis. Or axis. I got it. I'm going to move my background scroll speed to 10, and let's watch to see what happens with this turret. Yeah, he's definitely...
Yeah, it's starting out wrong. He's rotating on the correct axis, but he's just facing the wrong direction to start with. Play the game and go into the playing mode, and then pause it, please.
Okay.
And now zoom up on us.
Right.
Yeah, you see, that's at the wrong.
Yeah, exactly. The negative 90 rotation got removed. See, because it should be negative 90. And then the Y will determine how it rotates. So what I should do is go ahead and make sure that I pass in negative 90 to the X component of our transforms for our activating and for our start.
Yeah, because that confused me, because it didn't happen to me. Oh, I know why that didn't I do a plus equals or something? Probably.
No. You did assignment.
Yes, I did at some point.
Yeah, you must have at some point.
Transform position. I did transform position plus equal. I'm sure I did. Because that's why I didn't get that problem.
But anyway, now we have a rotating turret.
Anyway. Cool. So, yeah. Pop the code back on the screen.
Alrighty. So, at this point, this is pretty much it as far as today's lesson. If you guys have questions, be sure to stick around. We'll be here for you guys. Gavin, you mentioned something about homework earlier.
I did. Any idea what it was?
That's why I'm asking you.
No. Well, obviously, the first part of homework is to get to this point.
Yep.
Secondly, I thought it'd be interesting by this point, you should be able to lay out a level made of these components.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to just drop some things in at random to show what?
Well, yeah. I mean,
and I can give you some a couple of helping pointers. First thing, your small deck and your turret small are 5 units across. If so, keep that in mind. If you space things out to 5, things will get easier for you for a start in terms of, making things look nice together. I found, well, actually, have you got handy the version that I sent back to you? Just because it's just got something built in it, save actually, and you can show it.
Oh, are you referring to what you saw on Tuesday? Because
Yeah.
I do actually have that. Let me pull it up real fast. Okay.
So don't be scared. This is going to involve creativity this week. This is what something I chucked together when I was testing these. You'll notice we've got a big boss turret at the back there as well. That's just a scaled-up version of the small turret. It's much the same thing that we did with the decks.
Yep.
You're going fast now.
But yeah, so you can do a lot of fun stuff with the prefabs that we've already created.
We've made essentially 2 prefabs. Although we've got different sizes of deck,
Yep.
we could just as well have not done. We could have just stretched them out as we made them. And but actually, if you go ahead and select I've got mouse control as well, haven't I? Yeah. Now notice here you can start to do things like this, where I've made a deck with 2 turrets. But it's just made in exactly the same way as the prefab that we made from meshes. But instead of starting with meshes, you start with other prefabs. So you drag a couple of prefabs into the scene, put them where you want them, create a new game object to hold them, parent them into that, and make that into a prefab. So over here in this project for prefabs, we've got a deck with turrets, the deck frames, finish lines, and also twin turrets, which I think I used further over there.
Yep.
Yeah, these 2, which is just 2 turrets next to each other. If I just pick one of these and position-wise, there's all sorts of odd scales and things because this was research stuff. But and also because that's a sub-object, I want that. There we go. Thank you. You notice I've moved I've taken a baseline as being around about -5 in world space because 0 is right in the middle of the gates and basically just go crashing into other stuff. So homework's going to be to
implement this and
finish the code and make a level.
Have some fun with it. There were a few questions that came in. However, I do want to go ahead and do one more quick little break for other final questions to come in for this particular class. Because after that, after I finish up the few questions that popped in, we are wrapping up today. And we're back. So, let's see. Why to use magnitude on the code? Well, we used magnitude on the code in order to determine the absolute length of a particular vector, resulting in us not having to do 3 separate math.absolute calls to determine if we are ahead of or behind the activation range. Would it be best to use the current rotation instead of hard coding? Maybe, maybe not. I'm just going to hard code it. In a perfect world, the models themselves would be set up in a way that would be importable into Unity without the rotation. But then again, keep in mind that these are temporary assets that are only being used, well, temporarily. So, yeah, I mean, that's really about it.
And that's also why I went about it the way I did with plus equals. But I explained at length to people off screen.
Okay.
But, yeah. I just, for each of those, I did plus equals a new vector 3 that just had zeros for x and z.
Yeah, that would work too.
Because that way you just don't have to deal with it at all.
Alrighty. If you want to edit a nested object in a prefab, do you have to instantiate the prefab in the game hierarchy, or is there a way to do it in the project hierarchy? I would not try to edit a prefab within the project hierarchy. If you want to edit a prefab, just instantiate it, and then hit the apply button. So for example, if I wanted to edit the finish gate prefab, I would move it into the game, I would update it in any way that I wanted to, and then I would hit this nice little apply button right there.
And his new asset would then have its positions where he's put them as default through apply, as opposed to being at 0, 0, 0. But there is one very good reason for for working on an instance and then applying, which is that you can't see it otherwise.
Well, yeah, exactly. That's the biggest reason, actually. You want to be able to see the object you're working on. And that's exactly why I created a scene called Scratch, so I could work with my prefabs without, well, having to deal with the rest of my stuff.
Here's a good point, but that is the key reason to do it that way. It's just that you have some sort of reference for what you're changing.
What did we do with metal hex grill texture? We did absolutely nothing with it.
That's just sitting there waiting,
Yes, it's
lying in wait for it.
biding its time. One day it'll jump out.
I might explain about that. I might explain about that off video afterwards in some great length, because it is odd.
What was the other code where you put -90 instead of 0? I put it in two places. One on line 57 right here, and one on line 31 right here.
I still think plus equals is better.
It is.
Because you don't have to deal with that.
No, it is.
So change it.
I mean, I've written the code and I don't want to freak everyone out.
We're on video.
I know we're on video. And I'll freak everyone out.
You're talking like, don't talk to me like that in public. Where do we get
No, it's on a public-private thing. I don't want to freak everyone out. every time I change see, I have to be really careful about changing code, because every time I change my code, somebody's going to miss one of the changes I make to my code, and then their stuff's not going to work.
Well, that's their fault. Sorry, did I say that out loud? I'm terribly sorry.
You know we're recording, right?
Yes, I know.
Alright, I think my turret missed a setting. My turret starts at the wrong angle of rotation. As soon as it's activated, it corrects itself. Is there an initial rotation setting in Unity I should have changed? Not an initial setting that you should have changed, but an initial setting that you should have left alone. See, when I put my prefab for my turret into the scene, notice how the rotation of each one of these components is set to -90, with the exception of the riser, because the riser was actually properly imported. But everything else wasn't. So you shouldn't have changed the -90 that was preset on these meshes that were brought into the prefab. Do I add the turret collider script to new deck frame, new deck sheet, new rotator, and new riser? Yes. Except for the sheet part. You should add your turret collider to your new deck frame, your new rotator,
That
and your
one
new
is
riser.
Yeah, the one on the new deck frame, if you think about it, that includes, by default, the new deck sheet, which is just the sheet across the bottom of it there. So, again, this is like when we were dealing with the deck blocks themselves. There's no point in putting two colliders on, one for the framework and one for the block, because they both take up virtually the exact same space. And particularly with collisions, you want to be doing as few of those and as simply as possible. That's why you use simpler meshes for mesh colliders than for the actual meshes. The meshes.
Is new riser moving up or backwards? Mine is moving backwards, and I think I have my code correct. Looking at the model, it is Z up. I don't know.
We'll answer that one afterwards off camera, and you can just switch over to his screen and we'll have a look, because it'll be some combination of 90 degrees off somewhere.
So homework is to make a level, indeed. Well, it's also to make a level and, finish the code. Yes,
Yeah.
Here's update dead and update deactivating. Everything. Please note that the way the code is currently written, update deactivating never gets invoked, but that will change. Everything seems to be running fine, but my lighting is making it impossible to see if the turret actually moves. Any suggestions?
Yeah.
Change your lighting.
Basically, slow right down for a start. Change your background scroll speed so that it's incredibly slow. And yeah, or just move the camera in closer to the. The other thing would be to like we did, just pause in game and check at the start what direction it's facing, and then at the end of the game, or not at the end of the game, but once the player is definitely within, visually the player is clearly within range of it, pause the game again and look into the scene view and see. The other option is just to grab the scene view, drag it off into another window, and have that there focused on. Actually, you'll need to start it with it focused on the player, and then everything else will work fine. It will scroll into view, I think. Do you have anything to add on that one?
Actually, hold on. I made a mistake. I thought I made a mistake, but then I didn't make a mistake. Actually, this should be 0. For someone pointed out in the questions that this should be 0.
Yeah, position's 0. It's only rotation.
Yeah. And then I changed it because I thought, well, wait a second, I made a mistake. But actually, it should be 0 because this is the local position. We're not mutating the rotation. But I tried to sneak that one in there, but just in case anybody's actually watching.
So you won't change the thing that we've both agreed is better, but you'll try and sneak through a change that is inaccurate. That's brilliant.
Exactly. Hey, I'm a developer. I do what I want. Okay. Is there any way when you hit play that the scene view it does not move? You can hit pause. Well, let me actually switch to my correct scene. If you don't want things to move, just, well, hit pause. And then you're paused.
I think what it is I'm assuming you're trying to follow to see whether your thing is moving. What I would do is, can you give me mouse? Have I got mouse control?
I swear you do.
Click. No, I think. Oh, yeah, there we go. I minimised it earlier, and I think it's probably TU had hissy fit.
What are you doing?
This.
Oh.
So split that temporarily, so that you've got your scene view and your game view. Now, you're going to want to focus up in the scene view on your player. Did that click take? I bet it didn't. Let's click over there and make sure it did. Frame up here and then zoom out a little bit. Zoom across a bit. I can't, haven't looked at the scene for a few hours and I can't remember what sort of size I need to be looking at to see. But anyway, that's the idea. And then hit play. Come across into here, and everything will scroll past you. So, and position the camera obviously somewhere where it's showing whatever it is you want to see. And then, yeah, you can pause if you need to.
Yep. Okay, so are there any more questions? My riser is moving backwards as well? Is it?
Who it is?
No, Y is 1.
Yeah, Y is one, but look at it, it's moved backwards. You can see it's moved backwards. There's a big hole in front of it. It's supposed to have moved upwards. Click on local at the top left. All right, don't. There we go. Huh. Is that the one that you said didn't have the -90 on it? Because it should have had the -90 on it, clearly. When it came in.
Well, let's fix that. There we go. Okay, so to fix that particular error, that was another issue with the whole moving thing. I moved the result of the lerp operation to the Z component on both line 75 and line 56.
That is odd. Is that different from? Is that definitely different from the code I sent
No,
you?
that's the code you sent me was how I had implemented this algorithm.
Yeah. That is weird then, because I didn't actually check. The only change I made between the rough version of the riser and the model and the one that I sent you was to scale it in half, so that we didn't have to deal with the odd scales.
Well,
so it should have worked exactly the same. That's
yeah, it feels like it's another Z-up bug, which will happen with Unity. Okay, so if that's about it for questions that we can answer on video, then I think it's time to tell all the future people goodbye.
Goodbye, future people.
Goodbye, future people.